Salem witch trial or the communist witch hunt of the 50s. I certainly see the financial motive in Hitler's Germany, but has there been a consistent application of the profit motive throughout future inquisitions?
No, there hasn't. I make the argument in my book that there are certain features of the Inquisition that have been copied, they provided a model that was so compelling that from time to time over the centuries, long after the Inquisition itself was out of existence, these tools and techniques were copied. The expropriation of wealth was not copied in Salem, and it was not copied during the Hollywood blacklist, although, as you have pointed out, it was copied very, very directly and explicitly in Nazi Germany and in Stalinist Russia.
Could we not make an argument that it was also there was a profit motive during World War II here in the United States with the internment of the Japanese Americans?
Well, that's another example, and I would concede that point to you. I point out in my book that the suspicion, and this is one of the features of the Inquisition. The Inquisition played on people's fears. It painted a picture of a vast conspiracy, a vast underground conspiracy that placed Christendom at risk and excited people's fear and even their paranoia about these heretics who could not be seen but were eating away at the fabric of Christendom. And they use that fear and anxiety to justify all kinds of excesses. Now, in World War II, tomorrow morning, or this morning, I guess, in some parts of the country, we're celebrating Pearl Harbor Day or observing Pearl Harbor Day. There was a real attack on December 7th. That was a real threat. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But the panic response at the beginning of World War II was to take 110,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry and put them behind barbed wire out of the fear that they would be saboteurs or traitors. That was a totally unfounded fear. We overreacted, and playing on people's fears to provoke these kinds of responses is another technique borrowed from the Inquisition, and I think, as you're pointing out, those families, Japanese-American families, lost their homes, their businesses, their farms, their automobiles, their possessions, and were forced to sell at a fraction of their real value, or saw their property impounded. And certainly that was resembled the technique of the Inquisition to expropriate the wealth of its victims.
And in as much as there is always, or seems like there has been since the very, founding of this country, a kind of secular church related to our patriotism. That one is, sort of throughout history given to God and country. But even in the United States, it seems like there are times when one can be persecuting somebody, say like how the Japanese Americans were persecuted during World War II, even if it was, perceived as being something that we had to do, regardless of what we wanted to. I'm sure there are many more people out there that were enthusiastically, creating the economic conditions that led to these massive sell-offs by Japanese Americans before they went into the internment camps, much more gleefully than others. That it's sometimes hard to not see it as its own kind of religious inquisition, but it's just kind of done under the name of patriotism or God and country, as opposed to God and the church.
Well, I think that you've touched on a very important point, which is that there is a kind of a civic religion that we have embraced. Now, I would make the argument that the founding fathers of the American democracy certainly did not make that assertion. They believed earnestly in separation of church and state, and one of the reasons is that they saw the Inquisition as an example, as a worst-case scenario of what can happen when there isn't a wall between church and state.
Sure.
But certainly it's true that as the decades and centuries passed, We have come to think of ourselves as a religiously based democracy, and I think an argument can be made, and I'm perfectly willing to be the one to make it, that everyone is safer, both religious people and non-religious people, and religious people of every religion are safer if we maintain a strict separation between church and state and avoid these kinds of excesses that took place in earlier eras and in the example that I've given from the history of the Inquisition.
Well, let's take this then a little bit further. If you go through all of the different ways that you think that we can still see some form of the Inquisition, or the model that the Inquisition gave to humanity, or inhumanity, as it were, that you still see afoot in the world today.
Well, I believe that the war on terror, which followed in the wake of 9/11, shows us that the danger of overreacting out of fear and panic and carrying out the kinds of excesses that the Inquisition also carried out is still present. Now, I'm quick to concede, as I did with the case of Pearl Harbor, that the people who attacked us on September 11th, 2001 were real enemies, and they committed real acts of violence, and those were real crimes. And we are in a war against terror. But the problem is that in the same way that we overreacted by imprisoning 110,000 innocent Japanese Americans who committed no crime at the time of their arrest or thereafter, we have had examples of overreaction in the war on terror. The most striking examples, we touched on it at the very beginning of our conversation, is that out of this terrible panic over the risk of another attack, prisoners in American custody were subjected to the same torture that the Inquisition used. We called it waterboarding. The Inquisition called it ordeal by water, but it's the same torture. America has prided itself, and should continue to pride itself on rejecting torture, on upholding values that set us against torture, and yet out of panic, we resorted to torture. That's an example, a very striking example of that long shadow of the Inquisition.
I just heard somebody defend those, what do they call them, aggressive interrogation techniques.
Harsh interrogation technique.
Right.
That's a euphemism for torture.
Right. I just heard somebody defend that the other day and say that has made us safer because we have been able to get actionable information from these would-be terrorists through this process. And that reminded me of what you said earlier, when the church maintained only through torture could real truth be revealed.
Well, I want to say that everywhere I go to talk about my book, someone will say this to me. They'll say, we need to torture, or we have successfully tortured because of the imminent threat of terror, of another act of terrorism, and we've avoided it by using torture. And I would answer that question, first of all, by saying, I have to be honest and say I'm not an expert on interrogation techniques, and I'm not going to I'm not going to assert that I am, but I can tell you one thing, or share one thing with you. What history has proven is that torture is an ineffective way to get actionable intelligence, because people will tell you anything to get the torture to stop. That's the whole point of torture. It's an excruciating experience. You want it to stop. You say what you have to say to get it to stop. You will tell any lie. You'll assent to any proposition that the torturer puts to you. Police agencies, police interrogators know that's not a good way to get actionable intelligence. It's unreliable intelligence.